Okay, so where we are now is we finished male reproductive system last time, which big picture we said that both male and female reproductive systems are about creating gametes in the gonads, primary sex organs, right? And then a series of glands and tubes and structures that are transporting, protecting those gametes in some way. Now for the female reproductive system, we're going to see those functions as well, but then we're also going to see organs that are associated with development, right? Supporting an early embryo and later fetus and things like that. So it's a bit more complex to be sure, but we'll do the same thing. So we'll do the tour. We'll go through a very basic kind of stopover of the different female reproductive organs, attached functions to the structures like we've been learning in lab. And then after that, we'll get into, like we did for male, we'll get into talking about the development of the gametes, gametogenesis. Before we were talking about spermatogenesis, and we learned that through meiosis in the male, we have, during sexual maturity, we have this constant production of millions upon billions of cells using meiosis, where we start out with one spermatogonium, and we ultimately end up with 4 from that original one, 4 different spermatozoa, right? And we'll compare that of how the situation is in the female, because it's going to be a little bit, there's going to be some similarities, but there's definitely going to be some differences, right? We know the numbers are quite different in terms of the gametes produced in males and females. Okay, so brief tour. Like we said, we're going to have our ovaries, our primary sex organs, as well as a series of different reproductive organs as well that are supportive in their functions. So here's our mid-sagittal view. If we were doing the tour in terms of like a tracing, so you could have a tracing question, tracing sperm throughout their pathway or tracing an oocyte. The oocyte is going to be released from the ovary. So we're going to see it exiting here. It's going to be picked up by the fimbriae, the finger-like structures that are surrounding the ovary. It's going to move into this widened area, which is called the infundibulum, the ampulla of the uterine tube. Uterine tubes are going to take it to the uterus, and the uterus itself is going to be a place where it may reside if it gets fertilized, right? It may reside in the uterus for 8.5 months or so. But ultimately, it's going to pass through the uterus, through the fundus and the body and the isthmus, the narrow portion. It's going to exit the cervix. And the opening that we see there leading down to the vagina is called the os, the external os. And that's going to lead down to the vagina and then ultimately out, right? So the pathway for the female gamete is going to be relatively short compared to the male. But that's the pathway that we would see on a monthly cycle. Whether the egg is being released and it's not fertilized and it goes out with the menses, or whether it gets fertilized and changed into an embryo and changed into a fetus, it's still going to follow that same path out. It's just going to be much delayed and much different coming out. Okay, other things as we were refreshing, right? We have the bladder that is anterior and inferior with the urethra draining it. So 2 separate pathways for reproduction and urinary in the female. We have the clitoris, the erectile tissue that we see here. And in fact, even as we look along its length there, you can see how it does look like our erectile tissue of the male, right? The spongy or the cavernosal tissue. And then those 3 are going to be enfolded within the labia. So we have the labia minus. So labia, if we're talking about plural, it would be labia minorum and labia majorum that we see towards the outside. And then here's the mons pubis that we were talking about, the overlying fat pad that is on top of the symphysis pubis. So we have the shared name. Then we have a variety of connective tissues. We identified things like the round ligaments of the uterus that go to the anterior body wall. This one we haven't really seen too much. It's the uterosacral ligament that attaches it to the posterior. There's going to be an ovarian ligament which attaches the ovary to the uterus. And then across the back here, there's going to be what's called the broad ligament. This is going to be a sheet of connective tissue that connect a lot of our female reproductive organs in the pelvic cavity itself. Okay, so Ovaries, just again, kind of hitting the different organs and talking about what they do. Ovaries are where our different follicles, as well as the oocytes, are going to develop. And remember that we've got a couple different regions to our ovaries, our cortex and the medulla. All of our different follicles will be out in the cortex itself. And remember that a follicle is going to be the egg or the oocyte plus the follicular cells. And so when it's a generic primordial follicle or a primary follicle, we're only going to have one cell layer, so we just call those follicular cells. And as we graduate to secondary and mature follicles, now we're going to have all different names for different layers of cells. So we're going to see granulosal cells, we're going to see theca cells, et cetera, coming up. So follicle is always going to be the oocyte plus the surrounding follicular cells. Primordial, primary, secondary. And then Graphian, this is that other term for a mature follicle, also known as a tertiary follicle, as we've been seeing in lab. This is going to be the secondary follicle that is the largest, that is the most mature, that's going to release the egg upon ovulation on the next cycle. So ovulation is an action where that egg or oocyte is ejected from the ovary itself. Then we know that those follicular cells are going to change into, like we see here on the timeline, here's primordial, primary, secondary, right? We start to see that fluid-filled antrum there and multiple layers of cells around it. There's secondary, secondary here as well. There's our mature follicle. It's called mature or tertiary or Graphian or vesicular. Man, can we come up with muff names? I like tertiary just because it follows along the 1, 2, 3 thing, but you can use whichever one you like. Largest antrum, that's going to be releasing the egg. So those follicular cells become the corpus hemorrhagicum that we see there, right? Because we kind of hemorrhage a little bit. There's a little bit of blood that can be released. Corpus luteum, which is going to be secreting hormones that we'll talk about, coordinating the ovarian and the uterine cycle. And then the corpus albicans, the white body, as it's kind of degenerating and regressing and things like that. Okay? And this shot shows us some of those different layers that we were having to learn in lab, right? So the zona pellucida, that's right around the edge, or corona radiata, and then ultimately, multiple layers out here, cumulosophorus, our granulosal cells there, and then our theca cells outside of that. So we'll talk about the roles of those coming up. So follicular development is going to be important. And so we can see in an ovarian cycle, and we'll talk about this coming up in terms of the timing of it and what causes it and things like that, a significant portion of the ovarian cycle, and there's going to be an ovarian cycle and a uterine cycle that need to be in sync, okay? A significant portion of the ovarian cycle is just called the follicular phase, where the follicles are developing, primordial, primary, secondary, and stuff like that, right? Another significant part of the ovarian cycle is ovulation. That's a very quick phase. Boop, pops out. And then we're forming the corpus luteum after that. So the third phase of the ovarian cycle, guess what it's called? The luteal phase. So it's nice that at least in some ways, it's a straightforward kind of naming system for those phases of the ovary. We'll see that coming up. Okay. So from the ovaries, we're going to go to the uterine tubes. Now we do have those little finger-like structures, which are called the fimbriae, that are going to be the catcher's glove, if you will, receiving the oocyte from the ovary upon ovulation. And then that's going to be routing it out down to the uterine tube itself. The interesting thing about it is, like I said, it's kind of like a catcher's glove, because in truth, it does catch the ovulated egg. So there's no direct connection between them. Think about, if you will, we think about a synapse, like a neuromuscular junction. That synapse, there's a synaptic cleft there. There's a space where the neurotransmitters have to diffuse across and then get bound to receptors. They get caught. It's like that, but on a bigger scale. So when the egg gets released, it's actually released into the pelvic cavity. Just luckily, there's a glove right there that's going to be the first to catch it. And there are smooth muscle layers within the uterine walls, as well as the uterine tube, as well as in these fimbriae. And so they undergo muscular contractions to kind of guide or draw in the ovulated egg. And both the uterine tube as well as the fimbriae, they have cilia along them. And so those cilia are beating, creating a flow that helps to also draw it in. But there's always a chance that that egg, for whatever reason, might not make it into the uterine tube. So it might, who knows, get just into the pelvic cavity and then probably be picked up and degraded and stuff like that. But on your ovulation day, you probably do not want to go bungee jumping because that egg is loose in there and be bouncing around like a pinball. Yeah.
So with that egg being loose, and if it doesn't make it to the tube, does that mean that the rest of the cycle pauses and stops and like, oh, there's no egg in here? Or does it continue and still the full cycle happens?
The feedback mechanisms that we have are still in play, right? The ovary is going to communicate with the uterus and let it know that an egg has been released. The main feedback mechanism that disrupts the ovarian cycle and the uterine cycle is pregnancy. So if there is an embryo that's embedded into the endometrium, then there's going to be chemical signals that say, hey, stop that ovarian cycle, stop the menstrual cycle, we've got to pause and do this for another 8.5 months. But the norm, commonly, is that egg is not going to get fertilized, we're not going to get that pregnancy signal, we're not going to pick up that signal. And so what's going to happen is that corpus luteum is going to degenerate into the corpus albicans. The progesterone that it's releasing as a signal is going to drop. The uterus is going to go into the menstrual phase as opposed to the secretory phase, the supportive phase, and then we start building it back and everything resets again. We start developing more eggs again or follicles again. We start building back the endometrium, etc. So the egg by itself is not going to produce any feedback mechanism. So it doesn't matter whether it gets lost into the pelvic cavity and is rolling around in there, or whether it actually makes it, as it commonly does, into the uterine tube and then gets kind of flushed out. Because it'll end up in the uterus, but with the uterine lining, with most of that endometrium being shed, it's also going to be shed. So, yeah. Okay. So we mentioned the uterine tubes, etc. There's also connective tissues that help to hold those uterine tubes in place. As we get to the uterus, we found that there are different regions to it, right? The fundus, the upper curved area, the body, and the isthmus, the narrow section of it. The opening down at the bottom, the neck at the end of the isthmus is the cervix, and the cervical canal has openings on either end. The external os opens into the vagina. The internal os opens up into the uterine body or the uterine cavity. This will be much more evident in the pregnancy series models that we're looking at today because the cervix itself changes in shape during pregnancy. So everything's going to change, right? The uterus is going to get much bigger and the uterine tubes are going to elongate and things like that. And the cervix itself lengthens. And so that becomes a much longer tunnel. And so the external and internal os are separated kind of physically more in a pregnant uterus and cervix as opposed to a non-pregnant. But those are the openings. The os kind of means mouth or opening. And then there are cervical glands, interestingly enough, that secrete a mucus regularly. And that mucus is also in tune with the cycles that we're talking about, the ovarian cycles and the uterine cycles. We know the uterine lining is going to change, and even the cervix itself changes in terms of its flexibility, as well as a little bit of its size and this mucus. So the cervix is opening to the uterus. And so as we kind of cycle back to what we were talking about in the male, we got to this process where we created the sperm cells, we transported them, vas deferens, etc., to the urethra, all that emission, and then ejaculation was happening, and they were deposited in the female reproductive tract, into the vagina. From there, they needed to be able to migrate up in to meet the egg. So that means up through the cervix, into the uterus, and trying to get into those uterine tubes where the egg is coming down, right? So the cervix is the gateway to the uterus. And so that we can either facilitate that and make it easier for the sperm to get through, or you can make it harder for the sperm to get through. So the mucus associated with the cervix can become thinner and less viscous during the time when ovulation is occurring, because that facilitates the movement of the sperm cells through it. Or in other stages, right, when we're developing the egg and even later on, or during pregnancy, that mucus, that cervical mucus, can get much thicker. And when you're pregnant, it can even form what they call a cervical plug. So that is preventing more sperm from accessing the uterus where an embryo is implanted and embedded, because we don't need any more eggs coming out, and we don't need any more sperm making their way up, because for those next 8.5 months, or however long it's going to be, we're occupied. We're supporting that one individual that we've achieved pregnancy with. Okay? So it's interesting to see even something like the cervix where you're like, oh, that's just an opening, what's the big deal? Even that has a role to play in terms of the cycles in supporting or kind of prohibiting pregnancy from occurring and facilitating the transport of those gametes, right? Because we said that that's what these organs are about. They're about supporting, transporting the gametes and transporting different types of gametes. Okay, so uterine wall. Remember that in the microscope we did see an endometrium and a myometrium, right? This is the inner layer, that's the muscular layer, smooth muscle. But there's also the perimetrium, which is the visceral peritoneum that's on the outside. So we didn't see that on the microscope, but there is that third layer on the outside. When we look at the uterine wall, this is kind of what we were seeing, right? So we were seeing all of this, which is going to be endometrium, and then we have the myometrium underneath instead. So this will be endo, and this will be myo. And in the endometrium, we have lots of blood vessels that actually end up kind of spiraling as well. And then we have those uterine glands. So there's a uterine gland right there. And we can see how it goes to the surface, and that's where the nutrients that it's producing can be released into the lumen of the uterus to support the developing embryo. And those endometrial glands, as we saw in the secretory phase, are going to coil more and more as they grow. And with that coiling, then the edge of them gets kind of wavy like that. And so that's what we're looking for in the microscope. In the proliferative phase, they're kind of smooth, but in the secretory phase, when they're actively secreting nutrients, they get kind of wavy along the border there, right? So that endometrium is where the implantation is going to occur. It's creating this fertile ground where the embryo is going to embed. But if pregnancy doesn't occur, this is where we also need to kind of clear the field. And so the endometrium is what's going to be shed, not myometrium. We're not getting rid of muscle. And in fact, not all of the endometrium. We want to save a little bit to grow back. And so there are, in fact, 2 different layers or strata of the endometrium. The stratum functionalis is about 90% of the thickness of the endometrium, and the stratum basalis is about 10% of the thickness, depending on what part of the cycle we're in. So this is the deepest layer, basalis, down towards the base, right? This is right next to the myometrium. So the stratum basalis is not shed. It's the lowest stratum, lowest layer of the endometrium, and that's always going to be there. And after menstruation, where we've gotten rid of the functionalis, it's the basalis, which is undergoing mitotic divisions and proliferating to grow that endometrium back. Okay? So the endometrium has 2 strata to it. Stratum functionalis, which is where the embryo is going to embed, and if that doesn't happen, it's going to be shed. Stratum basalis is there all the time. Yeah?
I was wondering, is that the layer, the basalis layer, that is like with ablation, where they burn off that layer so it doesn't regrow?
Yeah, likely. Yeah. Right? Because that's where it's going to grow back from. So if you're doing ablation where you're destroying cells because for whatever reason you don't want them to grow anymore, it would be important to get down to that level. Yeah. Okay. So lots of blood supply for nutrients, fluids, exchanges of gases, and things like that. So uterus, working our way down, cervix opens up into the vagina itself. So the vagina itself is where the penis is going to be received. It's also where our passageway for birth is going to be. And when we look at it, right, we're talking about this pathway where we're going from the ovaries to the uterine tubes to the uterus, down the cervix to the vagina and out. In any of these systems that we've been talking about, when we're deep within the system, then we have cells that are like, or tissues like epithelium that is like simple columnar, or maybe a pseudostratified or something like that. And so deep in the system, we do have columnar. But as with other systems, as we get towards the outside, we're going to need more protection as well. So when we transition to the vagina, we're going to get stratified squamous epithelium instead. So just like we saw with digestive system or whatever, right? As you get towards either end, you get the stratified squamous epithelium, this protective layer. So what we're seeing then is the openings again for reproductive system as well as urinary system, and then also the clitoris, the erectile tissue that is most anterior, housed by our labia minora and our labia majora that we see towards the outside there. And then our alternate view of the mons pubis, the fat pad that we see there too. One of the other things that we highlight is down in here, these triangles that we're seeing here, is often called, in this area, is often called the perineum. And so these are where a lot of our pelvic floor muscles are going to be as well, both in the male and in the female. Other things that we can see there is there are a few openings for vestibular glands. We know that in the male, we have glands that provide lubrication, etc., like the bulbourethral glands, and these are analogous to that. So there are going to be structures that are, during development, shifting one way or another, but may have a similar function, right? Erectile tissue, glands that produce secretions, etc. And in fact, when we look a little bit deeper, here are some of those glands as well, right? So here we can see vestibular glands along here, and the bulbs of the vestibule. So those are where some of those secretions are coming from. And if we look at the clitoris up here, you can see how it is very analogous. It's a homologous structure to the penis. So much smaller, but erectile tissue fills with blood in much the same way. Parasympathetic stimulation, etc. Okay. So we were talking about these external genitalia. Collectively, these can be called the vulva, the external genitalia, these various structures that we had already talked about. Vestibular glands, clitoris, perineum, as I talked about, etc. Okay, before we get to oogenesis, do remember in the female we have the mammary glands as well, as we were referencing prolactin and things like that. So the mammary glands are also considered reproductive in that they support the baby later on. So these are modified sweat glands. They have a structure, as we saw in lab, where we start with mammary or lactiferous glands that then produce their exocrine secretions that drain into specific tubes, right? So we see that we have lactiferous ducts that are going up here to lactiferous sinuses where they're kind of collecting and enlarging. And then here, we have additional kind of lactiferous ducts. So sometimes we say mammary glands, mammary ducts, lactiferous sinuses, and lactiferous ducts, all collecting the milk into the nipple there. Now, as we were talking about functional tissue and cancerous tissue, breast cancer, because these cells are very active, or can be very active, they can become cancerous as well. So as with other types of cancer, if at all possible, early detection is going to be the best. And because the breasts are a bit more exposed, right, you don't have to do brain surgery in order to examine them, it's really important to be able to do self-examinations to see if there are any kind of irregular growths. Just like skin cancer or whatever, if it's growing too fast, if it's asymmetrical, if there's a difference in terms of the structure, in terms of how it feels, that may indicate that some of those cells are kind of growing out of control instead. Okay, so let's bump back then to oogenesis. So this is gametogenesis, but specific to the oocyte. So again, we're going to go through and highlight how this occurs and when it occurs as well, and what's the difference between the different developmental stages. Now, remember that what we've been doing in lab so far has been, we've been looking at the development of the follicle overall. We had a primordial follicle, primary follicle, secondary follicle, tertiary or mature follicle. So that includes the oocyte plus the surrounding follicular cells. Now we're going to be looking at, okay, but like how does that first oocyte come to be? And are there changes in the egg cell inside of that follicle that are occurring as well? So let's take a look. Okay. So interestingly enough, as we learned in lab, all of the different oocytes that you're ever going to potentially release and develop and mature and stuff like that are produced before you're born. In fact, during that fetal period, you can see that we start out with a stem cell. It's called an oogonium. That's plural. Gonia is plural. That is, look at that suffix. It's the same as what we found in the male reproductive system. We start out with a spermatogonium. Those are the ones, like in the microscope, we found along the edge of the seminiferous tubules. Those are spermatogonia cells. Those are the stem cells that give rise to the mature sperm later on. So we start out with oogonia now. Those are the ovarian stem cells, right? They're diploid cells. And we'll make a bunch of those via mitosis. And they start the process of meiotic division. And so once we go from a stem cell and we start going down that path of producing a gamete, we graduate from a gonial cell to a site, a primary site. So we started out with spermatogonium and we went to primary spermatocyte once we started in the meiotic path. Same thing here. Oogonium to primary oocyte. Now the interesting thing here is that this is before you're born, right? This is in the fetal stages, early fetal stages, and we start meiosis. We get to basically like prophase 1, and then we stop. So we've created the eggs, we've started meiosis, but we've stopped, we've arrested it at that point. So what is inside of our primordial follicle and our primary follicle, etc., is going to be a primary oocyte. Just like we saw a primary spermatocyte, we have primary oocyte. And now we're sitting with that inside of the ovary. Okay.
Is that all in the fetal phase where it stops at prophase and it's basically just waiting?
And then it's just waiting, right? So now we have tons of primordial follicles with primary oocytes that have stopped after prophase 1. That's what we've stacked up inside of the ovary. So we do that, and then nothing's really going to happen until we reach sexual maturity. Then at sexual maturity, the hormones get going, just like we saw in the male, where we saw a big testosterone spike kicking things into gear. Same thing's going to happen. So pituitary gland is in charge of the ovary, right? In charge of the gonads, gonadotropic hormones. Follicle-stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormones start getting released from the pituitary gland and start stimulating that ovary, saying, hey, let's start developing some of those follicles on a monthly cycle. Graduate them from primordial to primary to secondary, etc. All right, let me show you. You're seeing some interesting things here. We're seeing things like polar bodies, etc. You're like, polar bears? What is this? No. Let me get to a figure here rather than text so that we can kind of go through this together. So notice we're seeing a timeline here. Before birth, childhood, and then basically this is the rest of the reproductive lifetime of the female, right? Okay. So this is what we were seeing, is that we started with the oogonium. We took one of those stem cells, we started it down the meiotic path, and it changed then into a primary oocyte, stopped at prophase 1. So inside of our primordial follicles is a primary oocyte. It started meiosis 1 and then stopped. Okay? All right. Now at this point, for like 13 years or so, it's just going to stay there, inside of the primordial follicles. Now, once those hormones kick in, the ovary gets active, what's going to happen? We know our primordial, under hormonal influence, is going to turn into a primary, going to turn into a secondary and a mature follicle that's ultimately going to ovulate an egg on a monthly cycle. Okay? Notice that on the left side here, we're just looking at the oocyte. On the right side, we're looking at the follicle. Notice that inside of the primary and the secondary and stuff like that, secondary follicle, we still have a primary oocyte. The only time we get to a secondary oocyte is once we get to that mature follicle, right? So once we get to that mature follicle where we're going to be releasing that egg, it's like, oh, okay, I forgot. We got to get everything, we got to finish up this meiosis, okay? And so the same kind of hormonal surge that causes the ovulation of the egg causes our first meiotic division to complete. And when we do meiosis 1 and we complete it, we go from a primary to a secondary cell. We went from a primary to a secondary spermatocyte. Here we're going from a primary oocyte to a secondary oocyte. It's the same, but it's just in the female. Okay? So that part's the same. But the wacky thing is, rather than producing 2 secondary oocytes, we get a secondary oocyte. That's our ovum that's going to be released. And we get this polar body. Notice that when we were talking about sperm division, all the sperm basically look the same, right? But notice that this secondary oocyte is much, much bigger compared to that polar body. It's going to be necessary that we do this meiosis. The main reason to do meiosis is to get rid of the extra genetic material, right? We have to go from a diploid cell down to a haploid cell with just 1 copy of 23 chromosomes. Because those 23 are going to combine with the sperm cell with 23 chromosomes. So we still need to go through meiosis here to get rid of that extra copied genetic material. But the oocyte itself, as you saw in some of the models in lab, that's going to be like the apartment where fertilization occurs, right? The sperm is going to enter into that. They're going to move in together, but the sperm is going to move into the oocyte during fertilization. So we want that to be as big as possible. It's almost like, the female gamete has this big condo, and the male is like living out a cardboard box, right? He's got this little cell. So if we're going to come together, we're going to live in your cardboard box? No, I got this big place. Let's live in my place. So this division, this end of meiosis 1, almost all of the cellular material, the cytoplasm and the organelle and stuff like that, goes towards that secondary oocyte. So that's a nice big cell to support and create this zygote. And then we cast off the extra genetic material in a polar body over to the side. That will never become anything else. Okay? All we're doing is getting rid of some of that excess genetic material. But we're keeping all of the cytoplasm and stuff like that. In fact, the secondary oocyte is one of the biggest cells in the body. You can almost see a secondary oocyte by itself, by eye. It does get really big like that. Okay, so at ovulation, we complete meiosis 1. Now the weird thing is, we know there's 2 stages of meiosis. So we took who knows how many years to get to meiosis 1, right? Because ovulation, with all of those different follicles that are inside of the ovary, each one has their own timeline. So the very first ovulation, the first one that you're going to get might be at, I don't know, whenever your first ovulatory cycle occurred. Could have been at age 11, 13, or something like that, right? So that very first one that was ovulated is at least 11 years old, at least. But we know that all those other primordial follicles that are on other timelines, your last one that you ovulate at whatever age, I don't know, could be 50. That one's 51 years old. That oocyte that gets released is 51 years old. It's been waiting in the ovary all of those decades, right? So the timeline in terms of this gametogenesis between male and female, totally different. Male takes a couple months. Female, to complete meiosis, it may never complete, right? If the egg doesn't reach maturity and stuff like that, it doesn't become a primary and a secondary and finally a mature follicle, it may never complete, but when it does complete, it could take decades and decades and decades for it to complete meiosis. But we get to meiosis 1 at ovulation. Now, how are we going to complete meiosis 2? Meiosis 2 down here only occurs if the sperm contacts and fertilizes the egg. That's the only time meiosis 2 occurs. Because there's no reason for it to occur otherwise, right? So that secondary oocyte does have extra genetic material that it still needs to get rid of, but it's not going to get rid of it by doing meiosis 2 unless the sperm comes into contact with this little bag of enzymes in the acrosome, eating its way through. Then it will very quickly complete meiosis 2, get rid of that extra genetic material again. Get all the way down to 23 chromosomes ready to go for fertilization, for the combination of the genetic material from the male and the female gamete. Okay? So what that means is that, in truth, in terms of meiosis completing in oogenesis, it only completes during a pregnancy. So how many pregnancies are you going to have in your reproductive lifetime? That remains to be seen. But you're probably going to count it on one hand, right? So in the male, meiosis completes in spermatogenesis billions of times, right? In the female, probably less than that. So there are similarities, but there's definite differences here in terms of the timeline and how long it takes and what we produce. So at the end of this process, right, we start out with one spermatogonium. At the end of this process, if we make it through meiosis 2, we only get one mature egg or ovum. That's it, one. You go from 1 to 1. But that's okay because, like we said, you're only going to be releasing, in general, 1 egg per month. So 12 months out of the year, times 40 years, something like that, that's less than 500 eggs that are ultimately going to be released. So many fewer in the female reproductive system. So we don't need that kind of amplification effect that we get in the male where we go from 1 to 4. 1 to 1 is okay. Okay? So those polar bodies that we see here just degenerate. Don't do anything. And in fact, they may not even, that polar body may produce other polar bodies, but ultimately, even if it does or if it doesn't, they're not going to be functional eggs that can be fertilized or anything like that. Okay? So notice the names are still the same. We start out with a gonial cell, that's the stem cell. We go to a primary oocyte once we start the process of meiosis 1. So there, primary means 1, meiosis 1. Secondary oocyte is when we are now going to start meiosis 2, right? 2, secondary. And then we're only going to complete meiosis 2 in this process for a female reproductive system if the egg gets fertilized. Then we will complete meiosis 2. The other things that are produced here, 1 mature ovum. The other things that are produced are called polar bodies. Those will never become anything else. It's just our way of getting rid of that excess genetic material, right? Because we still, in preparation for this, we still go through interphase and we copy all of the 46 chromosomes, but we've got to get that 46 and 46 down to a single copy of 23. So we still need those 2 rounds of division to get rid of those excess chromosomes. Okay? Questions on oogenesis?
So the polar bodies are basically another set of chromosomes?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
So when we do meiosis, right, each time we divide, when we go from 1 cell to 2 cells and 2 cells to 4 cells, we are reducing the numbers of chromosomes that are in those cells. We started out with one that had 46 and we copied the 46, so technically it had 92. We go down to the next level, we have 2 cells with 46, like we said, like 2 copies of the maternal, 2 copies of the paternal, and then when we divide those, now we have a single copy of either the maternal or paternal chromosomes, right? 23 chromosomes there, 22 autosomal plus a 6 chromosome in each one of those.
On there it says the spindle, is that basically symbolizing the genetic material, or?
The spindle, remember that during meiosis or mitosis, the spindles are those fibers that help to guide the chromosomes, because that's what we're doing is we're kind of, lining them up, right? Metaphase, and then anaphase, we're pulling them apart. So they're showing the formation of the spindle there to be able to direct that. Yeah.
So it looks like, according to that the spindle ends up kind of degenerating as part of the polar body?
To a certain extent, yeah. I mean, once cell division has occurred, all of those proteins that end up organizing that, we kind of disassemble them and use the amino acids other ways, etc. Okay. So, what we're seeing there is we're talking about the oogenesis that's occurring inside of the ovary. And so really, a lot of that occurs before you're born, right? The development of the oocytes, oogonium to primary oocyte, that's what's then sitting in all those different follicles. We don't become a secondary oocyte until we have a mature follicle that's about to release that egg during ovulation. So as I mentioned, in the ovarian cycle, we have 3 different phases. So we've got the follicular phase, ovulation, and then the luteal phase. Now, when you see the timeline there, this is an average 28-day cycle. We know, as with all these different systems, that there's variation all over the place, right? So it could be longer, it could be shorter, etc. But, so don't be counting this off and go, oh, well, definitely ovulation, 14th day, right? There's all kinds of things, hormone levels that vary and stress on the body and things like that. So follicular phase, though, is typically the first couple of weeks there where the follicles are being stimulated to grow. Then ovulation is not even a day, right? It's an instance, if you will, where the egg is released. That's the second phase. Third phase is after the egg is released, those follicular cells become the corpus luteum. So while the corpus luteum is there and active, that's the luteal phase. So in order to understand kind of those different phases, first off we name them. Then this slide is just basically talking about what's going on. During the follicular phase, we are growing the follicles, right? Primordial to primary, primary to secondary, etc. The things that we are seeing in the microscope and on the models. As we get to the secondary follicle, we know we have more follicular cells, right? Multiple layers of follicular cells. We have theca cells, we have granulosal cells, and things like that. Those are producing estrogens. So as those follicles are getting bigger, as they graduate to secondary and then to mature, there are more cells, more follicular cells, and those cells are producing estrogens. So as you can imagine, during this follicular phase, if those are the cells that are producing estrogen, estrogen levels in the body, in the bloodstream and in the body, are going up during this follicular phase because the follicles are getting bigger and it's the follicular cells that produce them. Okay? So we'll look at that coming up too. All right. We have our fluid-filled antrum, secondary follicle becomes the mature or the tertiary follicle, etc. And then that oocyte is going to be released during ovulation, like we were talking about, from our mature follicle, also called our vesicular follicle. So by this stage, we recognize all these different stages of follicular development, right? But this part through here, of what we were seeing like on the models, that's the follicular stage, or the follicular phase, right? So the follicular phase is where we see the follicle developing. That is ovulation, so that's our second stage. And that means this over here is going to be our luteal phase instead. So the numbers there, 1 through 9, is just showing you things distinct from one another. Remember, this is a 28-day cycle. So follicular phase is about a couple weeks. Ovulation is boop, an instant, in essence. And then the luteal phase is about 2 weeks as well. So with that ovulation, we know that the egg's being released and bursts forth from the surface of the ovary. We know that that forms the corpus hemorrhagicum, right? There's a little bit of blood there. It actually has to go through layers of tissue in order to release it. And that mature follicle is kind of positioning the oocyte towards the surface there so that it can release. There are people, some people, that can actually feel that because it's bursting forth from the surface of the ovary. There can, like I said, even can be a little bit of blood associated with it. So there is, in some people, a little pain associated with it as well. So that, as in different classes through the years, every once in a while, I'll have somebody in class that are like, yep, that happens to me. And everybody else is like, man, you're kind of lucky. While it's pain, and who likes pain, at the same time, that's pretty darn convenient to know the actual day when you're ovulating, right? Because you can feel it. Most everybody else is just kind of guessing, right? There are other physiological characteristics that are happening. Like we said, cervical mucus changes, metabolism changes, things like that, because of those hormones that are going around, right? But if you can feel it, you can actually feel, and those people, and that's the interesting thing that I want to know about, right? 2 ovaries, only 1 egg being released per month. So, is it alternating? Which one's it coming from each month, right? right? Does it alternate? Is it strict alternation, or is it just like, oh, well, that one caught the hormonal signal, and so, look, I had 2 rights in a row, now it's a left. It's like Twix bars or something like that, right? Which one's better? But, so, I don't know, Heinz Mittelschmerz or something like that, probably some German scientist investigated that. They should really name that. It would be appropriately named for the first woman that actually let them know about that, right? But that has to do with the pain that can be felt at ovulation. Okay, so most of those ovulations are going to release 1 egg. It is possible for more than 1 oocyte to be released. And if that's the case and those multiple oocytes get released, then you may have the chance at fraternal twins, right? Fraternal twins, 2 different oocytes, 2 different sperm cells. So fraternal twins are where you can have 2 girls or 2 boys, or a girl and a boy. Because fraternal twins, 2 separate oocytes, 2 separate sperm cells, they are no more similar than a brother and sister. They're just born on the same day. But genetically, no more similar than any other brother and sister, or any other sister and sister, or any other brother and brother. Identical twins, totally different, right? The name indicates that what happens is we start out with 1 oocyte, 1 sperm cell, fertilization, 1 zygote. We know that after that we get into 2 cell, 4 cell, right? 8 cell, 16 cell, morula, stuff like that. Somewhere in that process when we're undergoing cleavage, rather than having those cells all stick together, about the time when we get to the morula, for whatever reason, during those divisions, it separates. And so it separates. Now we have 2 balls of cells that are continuing to divide to become a blastula and stuff like that, and establish a placenta and things. But genetically, same cell that they started with. So those are identical twins instead. So they have to be 2 girls or 2 boys. Can't have a girl and a boy because they have the same genes, right? So, okay. So then, like we said, luteal phase is where our corpus luteum is formed after the egg is ejected. And that corpus luteum, its main job is to release hormones, most notably progesterone, a little bit of estrogen as well. And the corpus luteum is signaling the uterus that the egg is on its way, that the uterus should be preparing for a potential pregnancy and implantation to occur. So if that doesn't occur, right? In essence, the mother's body is listening in various ways, with chemoreception and things like that, listening to see if a pregnancy has occurred. If it doesn't occur, then it's like, well, I guess we're not having guests in the guest room. So what we need to do is change the sheets, right? So we're going to get rid of that endometrium, that stratum functionalis, and we're going to then start building it back for the next month when the possibility of another guest might occur, right? So if there's no feedback that a pregnancy occurs, then the corpus luteum in the ovary is going to degenerate, the endometrium in the uterus is going to degenerate, and we're going to reset the clock and we're going to start developing again. Okay? If pregnancy occurs, there's going to be a hormonal feedback that is going to maintain the endometrium, supportive environment of the uterus. The whole ovarian cycle is going to take a pause because we don't need to develop any more and mature any more oocytes, because now we need to focus our efforts on that embryo and fetus that we're supporting instead. So those cycles that are occurring in the ovary are going to pause. Those cycles that are going to occur in the uterus are going to pause as well. We don't want menstruation. We won't want to get rid of that endometrium because now it has a job to do supporting that embryo and fetus. Okay. So ovarian cycle is what we were talking about. And of course, as we talked about, what's going on in the ovary is established and controlled by the pituitary gland. We have 2 tropic hormones, gonadotropic hormones. Tropic hormones that are going down and controlling the gonads, in this case the ovary. What are those gonadotropic hormones? Yeah, so LH, which stands for what? Luteinizing hormone, and FSH, which stands for follicle stimulating hormone. Okay? So upon puberty and stuff like that, you're going to start seeing that control axis get active, right? So the hypothalamus is going to tell the pituitary gland to start releasing follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. That's going to tell our ovary to start going through its ovarian phases. And then the sex hormones released from the ovary, estrogen and progesterone, are going to communicate with the uterus in order to keep it in sync as well. Okay? So the gonadotropic hormones, it's in the name. The hormones from the anterior pituitary are going down to the ovaries to tell it and control the ovarian cycle, to tell it to develop our different follicles, etc. Whereas the estrogen and progesterone, those sex hormones, their primary role is going to be to tell the uterus what's going on as well. Okay, so there are hormones, right? Follicle-stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone. So as you can imagine, follicle-stimulating hormone is controlling the follicular phase. The development of the follicles, which is the whole reason we have that name for the follicular phase, is under the control of follicle-stimulating hormone. That's what gets the follicles to go primordial to primary to secondary, etc. Luteinizing hormone is, this name comes from, it's establishing and creating the corpus luteum, right? In order to make a corpus luteum, we've got to kick out that egg. We've got to ovulate so that we can form the corpus luteum right afterwards. So luteinizing hormone is in control of both ovulation, kick the egg out, and the formation of the corpus luteum afterwards. So it's responsible for, luteinizing hormone is responsible for ovulation and the luteal phase of the ovary. So we have two gonadotropic hormones, follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. Follicle-stimulating hormone controls follicular phase. Luteinizing hormone handles ovulation and the luteal phase instead, right? So we have one phase of the ovarian cycle handled by follicle-stimulating hormone, 2 and 3 phases of the ovarian cycle handled by luteinizing hormone instead. Okay, so we're going to see that on a graphic coming up. And then, of course, there's a feedback mechanism, like we said. There's always a feedback mechanism. With these hormones, we command a certain organ or a certain tissue to do something, and then we wait to make sure it's done. Just like in your job, if your boss says, hey, I need you to go straighten up aisle 3, later on in the day, your boss is going to cruise by aisle 3 and make sure that everything's straight on there, right? And that'll be the feedback. If aisle 3 is straight, then I don't got to do anything. Homeostatically regulated. If aisle 3 is a mess, then guess what? Negative feedback coming your way. Go back there, do it again, right? So estrogen being produced, things like that, progesterone being produced from the corpus luteum, that's going to be part of the feedback cycle in terms of things like luteinizing hormone, etc. Okay, so that's what we're seeing here. This figure here is just going through what I was just talking about. There's our pituitary gland. Pituitary gland putting out gonadotropic hormones, follicle-stimulating hormone, and luteinizing hormone. So here is follicles developing. So follicle-stimulating hormone is the main thing that is controlling that. Ovulation is mainly controlled by luteinizing hormone. A big spike in it causes ovulation, and then luteinizing hormone stays high to create our corpus luteum that we see right there. And you can see some of the feedback mechanisms. Estrogen's going up, that feeds back and says, oh, okay, we got enough follicle-stimulating hormone. We've developed enough of those follicles. Estrogen and progesterone, as well as a little bit of this feedback hormone called inhibin, going back up to the hypothalamus, gives us feedback, oh, yeah, we made a corpus luteum. We ejected an egg like we were supposed to. So we're going to see those cycles go up and down each month. So those are the ovarian cycles. 3 phases, right? Follicular phase, a very quick ovulation or ovulatory phase, and then a luteal phase where the corpus luteum is being formed. Those are under control of follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. So now we have the uterine phases or the uterine cycle. What's going on in the uterus that is in sync with what's going on in the ovary. Luckily, there are 3 phases here too. These ones are controlled by the sex hormones. That estrogen that's being produced early and then the progesterone that's being produced later is what is telling the uterus to go through its different phases as well. Now it's a cycle, right? It goes in a loop. So you can kind of choose, oh, what's the beginning, what's the end of the cycle. In this case, we can say that the beginning, first phase, is the menstrual phase. This is where the stratum functionalis is being shed. We're resetting the clock on the uterine lining. So we have the menstrual phase to begin with. After that, we have to build it back. That is our proliferative phase, like we saw in the microscope, right, where we're building it back. Then we have the secretory phase. The secretory phase is where we have all those uterine glands that are preparing the endometrium as a supportive environment for the embryo. So 3 phases. Menstrual phase is the shortest one, generally. Proliferative phase is the next longest one that comes after as we're building that endometrium back. Secretory phase is we are secreting in the endometrium and making it a very nutrient-laden supportive environment. These ones here, these are alternate terms like we saw, just like there's like a follicular phase that I was listing, things like that on the microscope slides. I prefer these names because it's describing what's going on in the uterus, right? We're building it back. Those cells are proliferating. The uterine glands are secreting. But technically, it is coordinated with those instances and happenings in the ovary too, right? So the proliferative phase is occurring before the egg is ovulated in the ovary. The secretory phase is where we're preparing the gestrum because the egg has now been released. So this is post-ovulatory phase too. So you can use those other terms if you want, but personally, I keep it straight by using those other ones because they're more descriptive as to what's going on in the uterus there. So like we said, in terms of menstruation, we're resetting the clock here. We see a degradation, like apoptosis, where things are kind of falling apart and degrading. So the different arteries and arterioles and venules and stuff like that go into spasms. They have muscle, right, smooth muscle in the middle. Endometrial cells begin to die. And so that is the loss of blood. As that breaks down, those blood vessels are going to be losing blood, and the endometrial tissue is also going to be degenerating. So the functional layer is going to be sloughing off. It's going to be released. So that's what's happening during menstruation there. And like we were talking about, it's going to be under the control of hormones that are coming from the ovaries. So the estrogens that we see here and the progesterone that are being released, those are what are going to be coordinating our phases of the uterine cycle. We're not going to take a look at that quite yet. I like to get it over to this one instead. Because what we're seeing here is a snapshot of how the ovarian cycle and the uterine cycle are in sync in a timeline. So here's our timeline, days 1 through 28. Again, average, right? That's not going to be a hard number. In the ovarian cycle, follicular phase, first couple of weeks where we're developing the follicles, ovulation, very quick phase in the middle, luteal phase, last couple of weeks where we form the corpus luteum, etc. Now, these are the cells, right, of the developing follicle that are releasing estrogens. So those estrogens go into the bloodstream, and they are in control of this phase, the proliferative phase of the endometrium. You're looking at the wall of the endometrium here. So this is the myometrium down the bottom. This is the endometrium where it's been shed, and it's very thin, right? Just stratum basalis left. And now we're seeing the building back of the endometrium. So that's the stratum functionalis coming back. So during the proliferative phase, it is estrogen coming down from those developing follicles that causes the building back, the proliferative phase. Now look at here, we've formed our corpus luteum. We know that the main hormone that is produced by the corpus luteum is progesterone, right? So as that forms, progesterone levels go up, and progesterone is the hormone that's in control of the third uterine phase, the secretory phase, where those uterine glands get bigger and they start to coil and get that wavy border to them as they start to secrete more, right? So that's what we're seeing there. So the progesterone released from the corpus luteum is in control of that secretory phase. Now notice here, the corpus luteum, towards the end of this, if we're not pregnant, degenerates into a corpus albicans, right? A corpus albicans is going to be smaller, it's not going to be functional tissue, and it's going to drop our progesterone levels. Because it's only the corpus luteum, the active corpus luteum, that's releasing the progesterone. So as the corpus luteum degenerates into the corpus albicans, those progesterone levels are going to drop. Progesterone was maintaining that uterine lining. If progesterone levels drop, then what's going to happen to the lining? That lining is also going to drop. We're going to shed and we're going to go into menstruation. So a high level of progesterone maintains and creates the secretory phase. A low level of progesterone causes us to go into the menstruation phase instead. Okay? But it's the hormones, the sex hormones from the ovary, that are being the boss of the uterus, coordinating its three phases: menstrual phase, proliferative phase, secretory phase. Okay?
Say that again, when estrogen level is high versus low and progesterone?
So for estrogen, as estrogen levels go up, they are going to be causing that endometrium to go up as well. That's basically in charge of that proliferative phase. The progesterone levels, as those are going up from the corpus luteum, that's causing us to go into the secretory phase, where we are finishing growing and we're now enriching that endometrium. Without that progesterone stimulation, as the corpus luteum dies off, if you will, progesterone levels are going to drop. So they're going to go down. It's going to drop. And so as progesterone levels go down, now there's no signal to maintain that endometrium, and so we're going to lose it instead. We're going to go into menstruation. So a drop in progesterone is what causes menstruation. Yeah?
So after
I know we're about time as well, so.
So after the progesterone drops
Yeah.
and we enter menstrual,
Yeah.
what hormones are controlling that? Is that the LH and the FSH, or is there something else? that I
So the LH and the FSH are controlling the ovarian cycle. The estrogen, the progesterone from the ovaries are controlling the uterine cycle. So what we'll find is the ovarian cycle will start over again. And so we'll start developing follicles. As the follicles get bigger, estrogen levels are going to go up, and now we're going to start building that endometrium back up as well. So what we'll do next time, because that's a big topic, review it on your own, but then we'll start here next time reviewing the coordination of the ovarian and the uterine cycles, getting that straight, and then we'll kind of finish up. I mean, we're almost done with female reproductive system, then we'll kind of finish up with development and stuff like that next time. Okay? All righty. I told you women are more complicated than men.